Hello, you're listening to Leveraging Thought Leadership. I'm your host, Bill Sherman. What does it take to launch a thought leadership function within an organization? To help us explore that question, I've asked Sue Yasav to join us today. Sue served for 8 years as the VP of Thought Leadership and Content Strategy at Synchrony Financial. Synchrony Financial was a spinoff of GE Capital. And today, we'll talk about the challenges of launching a thought leadership strategy while the company is also reintroducing itself to the customers under a new brand. I'm eager to also talk to Sue about how she recruited talent from across the organization who will become voices for thought leadership. Ready? Let's begin. Welcome to the show, Sue.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So, you've come to thought leadership from a bit of an interesting route, value prop. Tell me a little bit about the world of value prop and how that led you into the world of thought leadership.
Well, interestingly enough, they're both unusual job titles, right? You don't see
Yep.
a lot of job postings for VP of Value Prop or VP of Thought Leadership out there. So yes, I was the VP of Value Prop at GE Capital, and I worked with retail partners to develop their value proposition for their credit card brands. And so I went from retailer to retailer doing that. And as a result, I came up with this process and I wrote a white paper on the process and an infographic, and it went over pretty well. And that evolved into, well, how do you go from value proposition to setting yourself up as a thought leader? So it really happens from thinking about a process and thinking about, okay, how do we get better at writing down what we do and making it more of a repeatable process? So that's how it evolved from writing one white paper to another to kind of making that as a launch, going from one process to another, launching value proposition as a discipline.
Okay. So, and as you mentioned, you started this work at GE Capital with store branded financing and credit cards, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for them, it was a new product or service that they could offer their customers to help them make purchases, right? But
Right.
you had to explain the value prop of why would you want to have a store branded card rather than MasterCard, Visa, American Express, Discover, et cetera, right? So you were having to do an education role in value prop. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, actually, it was the whole process of how do you develop a value prop for a business, right? So
Hmm.
it could be repeatable to any business. So first, you start off with understanding your customer, doing some consumer research, and then reaching out to the stakeholders of your business and figuring out what do you really want to stand for? What is your brand? And how do you portray those brand ideals? In this case, it was in your credit card value proposition, but really, you could do that for any brand. You could say, what do we want to stand for? What do our consumers want? And what do we want to give as benefits of being part of our organization or buying from us or hiring us? So, yeah, we found that after we did it, it was quite a repeatable process.
And that becomes an interesting point. Like you said, your entry into the world of thought leadership was I wrote a white paper, right?
Right?
And as I've said before many times, for many of us in thought leadership, the practice, it's either a second or a third act in a career. We didn't plan to land here, but then we realize there is a system, there is a process of how do you take ideas to scale, and it became appealing.
Right?
Now, did you have a thought leadership title at GE Capital when you were there, or did the VP thought leadership come when you with Synchrony?
It came with Synchrony. I actually wrote my own job description.
Okay, so let's
So,
talk about the transition
yeah.
from GE Capital to Synchrony and that transformation.
Yeah, when I was with Synchrony, I'm not with Synchrony anymore, but when I was with Synchrony, GE Capital was kind of launching us as our own brand, right?
Yes, so
So
you were a
we had
spinoff
no
essentially,
name.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, we had Synchrony had a deep experience in the field, but it was a brand new name. So it was really launching thought leadership for a brand that had been around for a while, but was unknown in the marketplace. So that is required a few challenges. What did we stand for? So that, again, talking about a repeatable process, we said, okay, so how do we do this? How do we decide what we want to stand for as a standalone brand after we got, we left the GE Capital kind of family? So we said, okay, there are a couple of ways of doing that. So first, what do we want to stand for? What are the pillars, strategic pillars that we want to stand for? And then what do
And
customers?
what were those?
Oh, back then, it was loyalty, analytics, and deep customer relationships.
Okay.
So those were the three pillars. I mean, there was
Hmm.
a lot of strategy, but that's what we wanted to
Right, right.
put out there in the marketplace, right? And then we said, okay, so what do our customers want to hear about? What do our clients, our retail clients, what is important to them? So that, of course, built into the thought leadership framework. And then how are we going to do this? Is it white papers? Is it infographics? Are there events that we want to sponsor? Or are there corporate, who should go out and represent the company? And what should they say when they represent us? So all of that was built into a framework of the evolving thought leadership discipline.
And this was in the early 2010s when you were standing this up. Am I remembering correctly?
It was, let's see, I want to say 2008, maybe a little before 2010. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you got to write your own job description.
Yeah.
Did you choose thought leadership as a title at that point?
I did not. We had been going back and forth about it a little bit because a lot of what I wrote about was based on consumer research, consumer
Hmm.
insights, because that's what we really wanted to connect with. So we went to market insights leader and it evolved into thought leadership, but then what did it mean, right? So I had
Hmm.
to write, okay, this is what I want thought leadership to meaning in this organization. And yeah, and it became the job.
Well, and that's one of the fascinating things, right? Is because many organizations are standing them up, and if you have someone on the executive team who's sponsoring it, and then someone who's in the role and founding it, their background and personality really help shape what thought leadership means within that
Right.
organization, from what I've seen, right? So, what were some of the things, if I may, that you put in that job description? What were the things that you wanted to accomplish that were on your portfolio?
So, one of the most important things was really the ability to communicate effectively. So, in addition to having these insights, having the strategic framework, really you have to like communicating. So, the ability to write, the ability to visualize information and insights and take reams of data and call it out and make it impactful and important to your client, not necessarily to you, right? I didn't really write about the payments industry all that much. I wrote about what our clients were interested in, which was retail.
Hmm.
So you have to have an ability to really research what it is that your customers want and give it to them in a format that is appropriate for how they're consuming data. So when we first launched, it was more about the written word. People had a tolerance for longer white papers, 8 or 9 pages and everything. And then it evolved to infographics, and then went from there to videos to podcasts. So you have to kind of almost create the vehicle that your customer's most interested in absorbing.
So you mentioned something as well in terms of speaking at conferences, and you talked about the pillars. Let's talk for a moment about recruiting people to speak and or to be voices on each of those pillars, right? And
Mhm.
how did you look across the organization and find people who would be that voice?
Oh, that's such a good question, Bill. Ultimately, they're super smart people, right? And we have the chief technology officer that very luckily knew how to write. So we wrote a couple of blog posts, and I was very supportive of that. I wrote a white paper with him, which was great. But you have other people in the organization in IT that you may say you're super smart and we want you to be one of the thought leaders, and they're not great writers or communicators or something. So at times I had to be the ghostwriter, chief of analytics, head of analytics. So I would be the ghostwriter. And our CMO at the time simply didn't have the time to write a white paper. Again, so I would step in and be the communication arm after absorbing what they wanted to communicate.
So some of it then helping them on a writing side, but then also for speaking. Were you identifying not only where to speak, but who should be speaking? And were you doing sort of that conference matchmaking, if you will, in terms of which podiums did we want to be on and what was the message when we were there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, back when we could go to conferences.
Right.
We went to,
2020
we went to
being
a
the
lot of
exception.
conferences.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the beginning, when we launched Synchrony as a brand, we were kind of a GE and not really speaking at any events or anything. So we decided that there would be maybe 4 or 5 events that we really thought were important for us to be at. And yes, then I worked with the communications team to figure out who should be speaking, what they should say, and developing the content for what they were talking about, right? So we had, we were a very big sponsor in the Women in Retail conference for many years. And so we were the primary sponsor, and I would be responsible for setting up the content for the executive that would present at that conference.
You really had an interesting challenge. Not only were you setting up a thought leadership shop, but you were also setting it up with a company that didn't have that name or reputation or recognition. What were some of the challenges that you encountered in sort of this 2 levels of sort of finding the place, not only within the organization, but also for the organization?
Yeah, that's again a really good question, because initially we just wanted our name out there.
Mhm.
So we were in airports and big signs at, I don't know if you've ever been to the NRF, National Retail Conference in January. It's just huge. Invested a ton of money on just big signs. Let's just get ourselves out there, get our name out there, name recognition, right? Synchrony. And then, afterwards it evolved from there, and it became a little more pronounced of, okay, now what do we want to stand for? And who should stand for it, right? From those original 3 pillars that we had, now those 3 pillars are something else, which is completely valid, right?
Mhm.
But it evolved from just get your name out there and get some name recognition
Help them
to,
recognize the logo, right?
right, exactly right, like
Yeah.
Synchrony. And I would have to say, and we do credit cards. So
Mhm.
now people almost know what I the company, but back then they didn't. So, and then it becomes a little more strategic afterwards.
If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. Yeah, say
Now that
more
we're out
about that
there.
in terms of the strategy, right?
Right.
So some organizations with thought leadership go after a broadcasting strategy. Some go after a narrowcasting strategy that says, we know that most people aren't going to pay attention to us, but we know our folks that we're trying to reach. What sort of strategy did you craft?
I think it was a little bit of both. So you can't say that well, in the sense that we still wanted our name out there.
Mhm.
Even last year, 2020, we wanted our name out there. But it became a little bit more strategic. What is important to our company culture? And diversity and inclusion came up, especially in 2020. Kind of we got there, right? But
Hmm.
especially in 2020, the leadership was very committed to that. And then also the other strategic goals, we wanted to really be known as a technology company and various other things that are more specific to the retail industry and then the other industries that the company wanted to get into at the time. And like I said, I don't speak for Synchrony anymore, but back then that was almost the evolution from broad to very specific.
And I think you hit on something that I've seen as the evolution from the long form sort of desire to sit down and consume content to give it to me in 60 or 90 seconds. Show me an
Mhm.
infographic, a short form video. People are looking much more for a pull version of thought leadership, and the long form push doesn't stick as well.
It doesn't. It's how people consume information nowadays. And not only that, I mean, think about podcasts, right? They're
Right.
so popular. We not only want to consume information quickly, we wanted to do it while we're doing something else,
Exactly.
while we're getting dressed in the morning, while we're driving.
While we're
So
working
it's
out.
not
Yeah.
only hit me quickly, it's hit me quickly while I'm doing something else.
Hmm. And so you have to have a degree of punchiness to the message.
Right.
Have to know who you're talking to. And like you said before, what are the problems that they care about rather than the topics you want to talk about? Because it's easy
Absolutely.
to fall into a monologuing sort of thing where you're talking, but maybe nobody's listening.
Yeah, and again, we go back to, and you and I had discussed this before, Bill, almost what the definition of content versus thought leadership really
That's a
is,
great distinction. Yeah, go
right?
for it.
Yeah, so it's peer to peer. I talk to you as an equal, and we have a conversation about what it is we're trying to achieve, or what you are trying to achieve as my stakeholder or as my client or customer, right? And that is more a higher level peer to peer, where should we go, where are we now kind of conversation. Content is more, as you throw stuff out there, you
Hmm.
say it's more top down, if you will. If you want to say, this is what I want to tell you and this is how I want you to hear it.
It's much more of a push. It's often much more transactional. And I
Hmm.
think one of the things that I'd pull out from the definition that you used for thought leadership is there's a respect and maybe
Right.
even a humility in the person who's doing the work as a thought leadership practitioner. If
Right.
you're coming as a know-it-all stepping in to solve their problems, people will roll their eyes and not pay attention.
Yeah, yeah. It's not so much a teacher, it's more a professional business person, one professional to another, and maybe you have a different perspective.
Mhm.
Maybe there's something else that you found out, like a market insight, and you talk to them about it. So that is more thought leadership.
Let's connect the dots a little bit. As you worked as a practitioner in thought leadership, did you draw on any skills that you had built from your days working in value prop? And if so, what were they and how did they help you?
Yeah, I had about a I don't know, 15, 20-year experience or background in marketing prior to thought leadership. So strategic marketing, direct marketing, a bit in communications. I was even in Lean Six Sigma functions. So all of that built into eventually what would be thought leadership, because you're presenting and you're trying to assess a process and building a framework out of nothing, and that's really what thought leadership is, right? So all when I'm facilitating lean workshops,
Hmm.
and now it's agile, right? It's not lean
Right,
anymore.
right.
And then going out to clients and launching their value propositions. It all makes you look at a framework and says, almost assess, what does this really mean?
So
How is this repeatable? What can we communicate about this?
And you talk about process, and we've mentioned it a couple times. And I think about, you mentioned Six Sigma and GE being one of the initial homes of Six Sigma to Lean to Agile. That's an interesting sort of through line as well when you think about the processes of thought leadership. Let's talk about process for a moment, as not thought leadership as the one off activity that you write your grand white paper and
Right.
come down from the mountain to deliver to the world, right? But
Right.
how do you set up a repeatable process that's relevant to today's pace? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, we touched on some of it. I think that it is a process, and it's not, to your point, let's put this out. I'm sure we'll get a lot of hits and a lot of likes.
Hmm.
It's first deciding, or actually doing a lot of internal work, saying, again, the pillars, right? What do we want to stand for? So that's an overall, overarching framework.
Right.
And then from there, what are our clients? What is important to our clients and our customers? And then from there, how are they consuming data? How do they want to hear what we have to say? And then what are the communication goals of the organization? Because not every strategy is going to go down to communicating out to the world, right? And then how do we want to say what? Well, before even how do we want to say, what do we want to say? What are the topics we want to talk about? And who should talk about these topics? And then after all of that, you say, okay, now what is the content that supports all of that? So there's definitely a framework, and it's not really as complicated. And a podcast,
Right, right.
it's hard to say visually. It's a
This
little
would be the
easier to
infographic
grasp.
time, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Well, and I think this also leads to a question that a lot of thought leadership practitioners struggle with. How do we define success for what we do? What does success look like? And how do we measure it? And then the flip side of that, if we have something that's not working, how do we identify that it's not
Mm,
working,
hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so if I go back to Six Sigma and DMAIC, for example, if you're going to define and measure, you have to understand your process, and you also have to understand what's an error. A lot of times content is put out there without criteria for success.
Right, right. I agree, and it's not easy. And this has been a challenge, and I've heard this on your podcasts in the past. It's quite a challenge because it usually points to a longer sales.
Absolutely.
And it is very impactful if it's done the right way. And I think I saw Longitude put out something like 78% of CEOs say thought leadership of a company makes them really consider that company in an RFP process. So it is impactful. The problem with measurement is, of course, it's easy to measure content. It's more difficult to measure thought leadership. But you have things like you are being asked for your opinion in media. You are quoted by media for what you say, and your experts are seen as the subject matter experts in that area. Again, shares and likes are important, but they're not the only thing. If you're asked to speak, if you are put on panels, and so all of these may be more, I don't know, qualitative measurements rather
Mhm.
than quantitative. But again, all of them are indicators of you are being thought of
Well, and
as
if
a
we
thought
tie
leader.
it back to your pillars, for example, there's typically more speaking opportunities than you could fill or want to fill, right?
Right.
And so, first order, are we being asked to speak? Second order, are we being asked to speak on the topics we want to speak about to audiences that we want to get in front of,
Are
right?
relevant. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
Rather than, yeah, we spoke, checked the box, and we did it. Have you reached your audience that you're trying to reach? And that's something that you can track. on a monthly or quarterly or annual basis and say, okay, we were trying to reach these folks. How did we
Did
reach them?
we? Do
Yeah.
they know who we are?
And
Yeah.
do they know what we're talking about? And did they hear our message? And if so, did they act on it? Right.
Right.
And so it depends. In some cases, you may have a target audience where it's a small group of people and you can measure almost on a name by name basis. Did they act? Right. Thought
Right.
leadership at the B2B level works that way sometimes. But in cases like you were talking about for retail, right, with Synchrony,
Mhm.
there were, tens of thousands of retailers that you were trying to reach with message, I assume, right?
Right. And they could go anywhere for content. Right. You have the National Retail Association, National Retail Federation, the NRF. You have a whole bunch of retail newsletters and websites tracking the field. So yeah, you kind of need to bust through all that and make yourself notice.
So, as we move towards the end of the conversation, Sue, I want to ask you this question. Many people who are now heads of thought leadership for their organization have only been in the role for the last 2 years or less. What advice would you give someone, having been in the role at Synchrony for as long as you had? What advice would you give someone starting out in this role?
I would say have a real good thought about what your client or customer wants to know about. So the closer you connect with their strategic goals and what they want to know about, what their challenges are, how they consume information, and how you can become relevant, not only relevant, but indispensable to that conversation. That is really the key to success. And then, of course, it's communicate and don't be afraid of making bold statements. So I have this 5 point presentation that I give on really how individuals can also be thought leaders. And one of them is use data, another one is make a bold statement, be futuristic.
Mhm.
Don't be afraid of that. Not everybody's going to agree with you, and that's okay. Just show that you're thinking about things.
Often, when you put out a perspective out there and people disagree, it'll either help you sharpen your own idea or get an insight into something. Because usually, if you get critical feedback, it's not that they're uninterested, it's that they see the world differently.
Right.
And that's
And that
powerful.
might be good. They
Yeah,
poke you and they
absolutely.
go, hey, support your position. And that
Mhm.
might give you an opportunity to say, well, I do have a good position, or I may have to rethink this one.
Yep. I didn't think about that context, or here's the data I have. Does that not line up with your experience? Right.
Right.
Yep.
Right. But even the fact that you are looking at what's happening in your field and really trying to be bold and futuristic and really thinking about it, it does set you up as eventually making it to thought leadership or being
Absolutely.
thought
Because
of
if
as a
you're
thought leader.
repeating what everybody else is talking about, then you're only amplifying the current
Right.
conversation.
Right. You're a curator, not a thought leader. Yeah.
Well, and there is a role for curation in thought leadership of elevating ideas. So, and I would guess this is true whether at GE Capital or Synchrony, that there were ideas within the organization that you spotted and said, that's a good one. I know I have an audience. And so you helped someone who had the idea get in front of the right audience with that
Exactly
idea,
right.
right?
Exactly right. Yep.
So, Sue, I want to thank you for joining us in the conversation today. You've mentioned that you are no longer with Synchrony. You've set aside your head of thought leadership hat there. What's next for you?
Oh, well, I have my own company now. It's called Marquette Marketing, and it's twofold. It is helping businesses develop their value propositions through this process that I just discussed. So it could be a lot of different businesses. I have a passion for women owned businesses. I also help leaders become thought leaders. So I help businesses and people in the industry who may have great brands, but have not really attained the thought leadership that they would like to attain out there. So I work with brands on doing that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us today, Sue. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please join our LinkedIn group, Organizational Thought Leadership. It's a professional community where thought leadership practitioners talk shop about our field. So if you're someone who creates, curates, or deploys thought leadership for your organization, then please join the conversation in the Organizational Thought Leadership LinkedIn